Hello and welcome to the New York State Museum's World Trade Center Rescue, Recovery, and Response. My name is Aaron Noble. I am a senior historian and curator for the museum's World Trade Center collections, and today we're going to be virtually taking you on a tour of the museum's exhibit about September 11th and the structure of the World Trade Center. The exhibit itself is designed in three parts, the first being Rescue behind me, which opened in September of 2002 on the first anniversary of the exhibit. Recovery will feature and includes objects of recovery from the FBI and NYPD operations at Fresh Kills landfill on Staten Island, where millions of tons of debris were brought in the wake of the attacks in order to process, looking for criminal evidence and personal effects for victims and survivors. And then the last portion of the exhibit, Response, documents the outpouring of support and sympathy, not only from across the United States, but around the world. So as we walk this way, the first object we'll see is one of the recovered pieces of steel, a portion of the World Trade Center columns. The architecture of the World Trade Center was unique in that it was structurally supported by the exterior walls, a skeleton wall, unlike more traditional skyscrapers, which have their core strength and support at the center. In order to be able to build up to the 110 stories of the two World Trade Center towers, much of the weight had to be kind of dispersed in order to maximize floor space, but also to make it light and flexible in the winds at that elevation. This particular piece of column is about 36 feet tall. It came from the World Trade Center Tower 2 and gives you a sense of the scope and the scale of these buildings. This portion would have been about between 1 and 2 stories of the World Trade Center itself. The central feature of the museum's exhibit is the Engine 6 pumper from the FDNY. This vehicle is one of hundreds of FDNY vehicles destroyed in the wake of the collapse of the two World Trade Center towers. This particular vehicle was chosen both because of the fact that Engine 6 is located within just 2 blocks of the World Trade Center, so its proximity to the towers, it was one of the first vehicles to respond, but also due to the condition of the truck. The front, as you can see, was very badly damaged and burned in the fire, but the back, though it's crushed, still retains that very evident and apparent FDNY markings and paint. This is because as the World Trade Center towers collapsed, this particular truck was parked under a footbridge across Vesey Street in Lower Manhattan. The footbridge fell on the back of the truck and actually worked to preserve the truck from further damage in the back. Because it was located 2 blocks from the World Trade Center towers, this is one of a very limited number of pumpers that were purchased by the FDNY that had the ability to pump water the full 110 stories up the World Trade Center. As such, it was parked at the base of one of the towers, pumping water, as we now know, ineffectively up into the water standpipes in the World Trade Center, which had been badly damaged and destroyed when the plane struck. So the water was not actually reaching many of the upper floors. The largest rescue really focuses on, this portion of the exhibit really focuses on that first 24 hours from sunrise on Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, through sunrise on September 12th. The museum at the time, in 2002, decided to really focus on and use a timeline of the specific events of the day in order to document and give people a reference to how the day unfolded and what people experienced. As this portion of the exhibit opened on the first anniversary, selection of artifacts became really critical and really challenging for museum staff. History museums have a tendency and we're used to dealing with things that happened 100, 150, 200 years ago. In this case, we were looking at objects of an event of enormous importance, but things that were happening within the last 12 12 months, let alone within our own lived experience. The largest rescue really focuses on, this portion of the exhibit really focuses on that first 24 hours from sunrise on Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, through sunrise on September 12th. The museum at the time, in 2002, decided to really focus on and use a timeline of the specific events of the day in order to document and give people a reference to how the day unfolded and what people experienced. As this portion of the exhibit opened on the first anniversary, selection of artifacts became really critical and really challenging for museum staff. History museums have a tendency and we're used to dealing with things that happened 100, 150, 200 years ago. In this case, we were looking at objects of an event of enormous importance, but things that were happening within the last 12 months, let alone within our own lived experience. One of the first pieces as visitors come into the World Trade Center gallery is a portion of the armrest from one of the two planes that struck the Twin Towers. This particular piece was chosen because it is immediately apparent and evident and relatable for anybody who has ever traveled by air, and it really serves, we think, to create a personal connection to the event and to the tragedy that unfolded on the two planes in New York, the plane in Washington, D.C., and the one in Shanksville, Pennsylvania as well. That being said, in 2002, as the museum was developing plans for the exhibit, it wasn't really clear that this would be an appropriate artifact. It was only working closely with families, and in this case, particularly one of our retired curators, Craig Williams, working closely with the family of Jean Roger, a flight attendant for United Airlines, and her father, in particular, Tom. It was only when Tom came in to preview the gallery and saw this armrest and came to Craig and said that this armrest made him feel closer to his daughter. His daughter had been killed on one of the planes, and her body was never recovered, but having this sense of connection to his daughter through the museum artifacts for the first time really confirmed to Craig and the other people working on the project here at the State Museum that this was a powerful piece, but this was also something that needed to be exhibited and shown. One of the next objects seems somewhat out of place. It's a New York Post touting the Democratic primary in New York City, which was on the morning of Tuesday, September 11th. This newspaper was found and recovered in one of the vehicles that was taken and was destroyed and taken to Fresh Kills. But it was chosen because there were several things on the day of September 11th, including the primary election, including the fact that it was the first day of public school in New York City. These were things that many of us take for granted in the course of our daily lives, but these were things that threw people's schedules off just ever so slightly. They may have stopped at the polling place to cast their ballot. They may have been delayed reporting to the office in order to see their child off to school. But it was all of these small events that actually, in effect, meant that the Trade Center was actually far less occupied than it had been, would have normally been under other circumstances. And it was these events and these decisions that people made without any kind of real thought or consequence at the time that have real dramatic ramifications for people as the day and the events of September 11th unfold. Much of the rest of the timeline features elements of the rescue, emergency signs from the World Trade Center, fire extinguishers that were recovered from the site at Ground Zero, unidentified equipment from New York police and fire officials who rushed to the scene, and many who tragically lost their lives when the buildings collapsed. In the center of the gallery aisle is a fragment of the Pentagon, which was struck by American Airlines Flight 77 on the morning of September 11th to document not only is this a New York event, but this is a national event and a global event. This case to my right features relatively small objects, but things that have really enormous significance and importance. We have a fragment of glass, we have a fragment of floor marble, a bolt that held the steel together at the World Trade Center, and an elevator plaque from one of the dozens of elevators at the World Trade Center. These are things that would have been used in massive quantities in the construction of two 110-story structures. During the recovery operation, however, very few pieces of glass, very few elevator plaques, very few things that we would really associate with office life were found, and that just really speaks to the scope and the scale of the devastation that was wrought when these buildings came down. As the timeline unfolds, we begin after the collapse of the towers. The exhibit focuses on the initial recovery efforts, the arrival of reserve and off-duty fire department personnel in search of their comrades, in search of survivors. This jacket was donated here by a former member of Engine 6 in the truck. I'd like to take a minute here to speak to you about the Engine 6 truck. As I had mentioned earlier, the truck was chosen because it was both recognizable for the damage it had sustained, but also for the fact that it was still clearly is an FDNY vehicle. As the museum personnel were working at the fresh kills recovery operation and working at Ground Zero, they worked closely with personnel and leadership from the FDNY in order to identify an appropriate vehicle to be preserved and brought to Albany as part of this exhibit project. But it wasn't just that they were able to obtain permission from leadership at the FDNY. It was very important for curators here at the museum to engage with and get the approval and the buy-in from families of the 4 firefighters that were tragically lost from Engine Company 6 on September 11th, but also the surviving members of the engine company. The truck was transported from Ground Zero to Fresh Kills on Staten Island, where it was marked and investigated by FDNY and NYPD and FBI personnel. It was flagged by the museum, and here, being a state agency, the museum was really in a unique position. Because we are a state agency, we were able to really call upon the breadth of state government to assist in acquiring an object of the size and scope of Engine 6. The truck itself was transported from Staten Island to Mid-Orange Correctional Facility by the New York National Guard, the 369th Sustainment Battalion. Once at Mid-Orange Correctional Facility, this is a New York State prison where prisoners are trained and educated in asbestos abatement and toxic material and hazardous material removal. Prisoners and personnel at Mid-Orange constructed a tent around Engine 6 and spent the next several weeks meticulously cleaning it of the toxic chemicals that had coated it once those 2 buildings collapsed. Once the cleaning was done, the men of Engine 6 and the families of the lost firefighters were invited to come up to the facility. And if you look at the hose on the back, it is remarkably organized and neat. And this is because it was relayed by the men of Engine 6, by the comrades of those 4 firefighters who had lost their lives in traditional pattern, as if the truck is ready for its next run. On the wall next to the truck is a facsimile copy of the riding list from September 10th, 2001, detailing the men who responded on Engine 6, Lieutenant O'Hagan, firefighters Jack Butler, Paul Bayer, Billy Green, and William Johnston. This piece highlights some of the challenges of working with materials from the World Trade Center. The piece is a chalkboard. The artifact is itself a chalkboard. It was never intended to be a permanent object. How do you preserve it? How do you present it to the public? So in the gallery, we have a facsimile. The original remains in the museum collection in secure storage, still preserved to this very day. But on the list, again, seeing how just a difference of a few minutes would have devastating consequences for many individuals. The men who responded from Engine 6 were on the 6x9 shift, which means that their shift began at 6 p.m. on September 10th and would have ended at 9 o'clock in the morning on the morning of September 11th. The first plane strikes the World Trade Center complex at 8:46 a.m. In that span of 14 minutes, you would have had a completely different group of firefighters responding to the event. And I bring this up because this has had tremendous impact and tremendous meaning for the men of Engine 6 and other firefighters who still bear, in many cases, survivor's guilt and still struggle with the fact that in their minds it should have been them to have been present and to have responded at the World Trade Center. At the turning point of the gallery, we have another steel column. This one, unlike the first one that we encounter as we walk into the gallery, clearly demonstrates visually the force and the absolute trauma that these buildings sustained during the collapse. This piece of steel came from the 71st to 79th floor of World Trade Center Tower 1. It was recovered, still bearing the original markings from when the tower was constructed in the 1970s. But for a piece of steel of that magnitude to have been bent as if it was a piece of paper folded in half really clearly demonstrates the force and the power of the collapse of the Twin Towers. As we start on the recovery wall, the first object again highlights the importance of working and engaging with the people who are actually conducting the recovery operations that were working on the ground. On the wall on this panel here is a small marble that was carried by FBI agent Richard Marks, who is in command of the Fresh Kills recovery operation. This marble was recovered very early on in the process. Agent Marks kept the marble in his pocket so that he could show families who came to Fresh Kills in Staten Island for periodic updates on whether or not anything of their loved ones had been recovered, to be able to show them to the degree to which these millions of tons of material were being sifted and sorted in the hopes of finding evidence of their lost loved ones. The cases along the recovery wall again feature artifacts and objects that speak to the life of the World Trade Center as a large and massive and incredibly lively and busy office complex. Keys, all bearing the stamp World Trade Center, more elevator plaques, security patches. Other objects for our younger visitors are a little bit less well known. We have one of two payphones that were recovered at the World Trade Center site on exhibit here. We have a stack of floppy disks in the case next to me that were fused together in the heat of the fires at the World Trade Center site. We have objects and materials that were sold in the gift shop at the observation deck of One World Trade Center. Also in this case here we have a fragment of a handpiece of a telephone. Again, one of the most ubiquitous things, objects that would be found in any kind of modern office. And to have so few of those recovered really speaks to the fact that the loss at the World Trade Center and at Ground Zero was really total. Photographs taken by museum staff showing the recovery operation and the sorting operations, and then objects that were recovered from several of the vehicles at the World Trade Center site. One of the lesser known aspects of the World Trade Center complex, because it was a government-run organization or facility, building number 6 at the complex housed the evidence repositories for many of the federal agencies in New York. So these firearms here, oftentimes visitors mistakenly think that they were either law enforcement or that they were used by the terrorists on the airplanes, but in fact these were weapons that were recovered in various criminal investigations that were destroyed. The destruction of the World Trade Center complex led to numerous instances of evidence loss in criminal investigations. This platform to my right bears a lot of the materials and features of the plaza level of the World Trade Center, things that would have been seen at street level. These iron or steel bollards that had been installed after the attempted bombing in 1993 to prevent large vehicles from driving onto the plaza unimpeded. A light post recovered and brought to JFK Airport Hangar 17 and preserved, and then eventually brought here to Albany. Fire hydrants and lamp posts from around the World Trade Center site. Here we have several larger pieces of aircraft. When these two Boeing 767s struck the World Trade Center, the debris was scattered across lower Manhattan. Given the size and scope of the planes, however, very few pieces were recovered. Initially, curators were hesitant to preserve or save pieces of the planes because there was a real concern amongst museum staff, not only at the State Museum here, but at other museums down in New York City, that the presence and the visibility of these plane pieces would be too visceral and too upsetting to our museum visitors and to staff at the time who were experiencing and trying to make these decisions really as history was unfolding. It was actually a member of one of the Airlines, a mechanic who was at Fresh Kills assisting with evidence recovery and identification of plane fragments, who pulled one of our curators aside and pled with him to change the museum's decision and to actually preserve and keep pieces of the planes. He recognized better than many of the museum that whatever the museum didn't take would have been buried at Staten Island at Fresh Kills and would never be available again. And he pled and convinced museum staff of the need to preserve this history and this part of the story and to keep objects to do so. Ultimately, the museum preserved 48 pieces of the two aircraft. None of them can be identified to a particular plane, but we know that both planes are most likely represented. This piece of steel is also included here. And I'll step back so that we can really focus in on this end piece here. This is a fragment of the aluminum honeycomb from an aircraft fuselage that has been fused because of the heat of the fire to one of the building's steel structural components. Again, highlighting just the immense trauma of the events of that day. So as the gallery was being designed and as it was being kind of laid out, the hope was that the final section, response, would allow visitors to kind of give them a moment to kind of collect their thoughts, to compose themselves, and to also be able to leave with a little bit more of an uplifting and positive and reassuring note. Currently on display behind me is a church pew that was donated here from St. Paul's Chapel, a historic church located just 400 yards from the original World Trade Center. Following the collapse of the buildings, there was tremendous destruction and all around the complex. Somehow, St. Paul's survived almost completely unscathed. Because it was so close to the Trade Center, it obviously could not open for and resume normal operations in the immediate aftermath. The congregation and the pastors at St. Paul's made the decision to open their doors to the recovery workers and rescue personnel in order to give them a sanctuary away from the noise and just the sight of ground zero. Eventually, hundreds and probably by the end of it, thousands of individuals came and volunteered at St. Paul's, providing everything from hot meals to counseling to chiropractic and massage therapy in order to alleviate the suffering and the wear on these men and women who were day in and day out at the site doing recovery operations. Several years ago, the church underwent a series of renovations in order to modernize and to update its interior. During that process, it was decided that they didn't want to destroy the history that was really etched into these pews. You can see the scratches, the scuffs, and the markings on this pew here. Those were caused by the tool belts and the equipment of recovery workers as they sat down to take a moment to rest. And so this object is really marked with the history of that recovery effort and the efforts that were going on at St. Paul's. So they removed all the pews. They contacted the New York State Museum and other historical repositories in order to make sure that that part of the story could be preserved. And the last thing I want to talk about is one of our rotating components in the gallery, featuring survivors of the World Trade Center and survivors of September 11th. There's a lot to focus on about the fact that nearly 3,000 men and women lost their lives in the attacks of September 11th. But it's also important to remember that between 30 and 50,000 people were successfully evacuated in just 102 minutes from 7 buildings at the World Trade Center site, making it one of the largest and most successful rescue operations ever undertaken. We have objects related to some of the survivors, and we've highlighted 3 personal stories to attest to the survivors of the World Trade Center and that part of the story. So as we conclude, people may not realize that the New York State Museum is one of the largest repositories for material from the state from September 11th. This comes from the fact that as the State Museum, we are the official repository of anything of historic value or interest that happens in the state of New York, and particularly with state government. When the Twin Towers collapsed, it triggered a relatively unknown clause within New York State education law, Section 233, which actually makes, because the Port Authority itself was managed by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, a joint state governmental agency, the building and the materials that were found there we kind of became the official repository and the government sanctioned repository for these materials. We've worked closely with the Port Authority. We've also worked closely with museums in New York City and with the organizing bodies that created the museum that is currently at the National September 11th Memorial and Museum at Ground Zero. One of the things that you may not have seen and you may have questions about is the fact that there aren't a lot of personal effects outside of the materials in the survivor case. And this is because, and this is one of the challenges that occurred in attempting to collect in real time, every effort was being made by the FDNY and the NYPD, rightfully so, to return anything that could be identified to an individual, to their families, or to, in the hopes that those individuals survived, to the survivors. One of the challenges with this, with the State Museum's exhibit, is that we do lack some of the faces of 9/11 that really make it compelling, and we're constantly working to update and to improve the way that this exhibit is interpreted, and to add new things to our collections. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this short tour of the museum's World Trade Center exhibit.